Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and I've recently made an in-depth video exploring all of the Super Nintendo's background modes. If you watched that, maybe you were wondering whether the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, actually had different modes too. The answer is, well, kinda. It did have modes, but they didn't have the same kind of functions and purposes as those on the Super Nintendo. It wasn't really the same thing, but it still had them, and I don't think this topic has really been explored much before. So let's take a look at the different modes that were available inside the Mega Drive's hardware. Okay, so to actually understand these modes, we need to get some historical context. The Mega Drive's Video Display Processor, or VDP, is built off the foundation of the VDP inside the Sega Master System, which itself was based on the VDP of the SG-1000, Sega's very first home console. This was a chip made by Texas Instruments called the TMS-9918A. It was actually used in a lot of video game consoles and computers in the 80s, including the ColecoVision, Creatorvision, MSX, and TI-99-4. On these devices, including the SG-1000, it had 4 graphics operating modes. Before I outline what those were, I do need to clarify here that by the time the Master System came along, called the Sega Mark III in Japan, these were all legacy modes, and were not used or really needed on that console. They did technically exist however, they weren't deprecated, but they were there mostly to maintain backwards compatibility with the SG-1000. There was however a very small number of SMS games that used them. Keep that in mind because I'll circle back to it later. These modes were totally removed on the Mega Drive, it wasn't compatible with them at all, so for that console, which this video is focusing on, this is just for context to understand the other modes. As such, I'm not going to dive into too much detail with these. Also, the way the modes are numbered might be a bit different depending on who you talk to, but what I'm using here seems to be the most common method of referencing them. It started with mode 0, otherwise known as text mode. True to its name, this was a text-only mode, and was mostly used for running development tools like a basic interpreter, and didn't support sprites. Mode 1, also known as Graphics 1, allowed graphics to be drawn with limited colours. Usage of this seemed really rare, on the SG-1000 at least, but Champion Golf is an example of a game that used it. Mode 2, or Graphics 2, provided the functionality to draw more colours on screen at the cost of using more VRAM. Most SG-1000 games seem to use this mode, such as Congo Bongo. Mode 3, also called Multicolor mode, was a low-resolution graphics mode using smaller blocks than the other modes. This was used on some other machines that used the same chip, but not the Sega consoles. I couldn't find any examples of this in action, so this really simple colour pattern that I threw together in BASIC will have to do as a demonstration. These modes had limited capacity for sprites, and none were capable of proper scrolling. Even though it looks like some of these games are actually scrolling, they aren't. They're just faking it by updating the background image in chunks as you move, which is pretty obvious when you look at a game like Wonder Boy. In addition to that, there were some undocumented modes that could be activated by essentially combining 2 modes together. Text plus Graphics 2, referred to as bitmap text mode, Graphics 1 plus Graphics 2, known as half bitmap mode, and Multicolor plus Graphics 2, or bitmap multicolor mode. If you know a bit of BASIC and want to play around with these modes yourself, I'll leave a link in the description to webmsx.org, which is an online MSX emulator that runs in a browser. You can switch between them using the screen command and specifying 0, 1, 2, or 3. Have fun! When Sega created the Master System, known originally in Japan as the Sega Mark III, they added a new, greatly enhanced mode, Mode 4, otherwise known as SMS mode. While the original modes were retained for backwards compatibility, as the Master System could play SG-1000 games, albeit with slightly altered colours, Sega intended for all new games to be made using Mode 4. This was a proper tile-based mode, with each background and sprite tile able to use 16 colours, proper scrolling in both X and Y directions, a much higher sprite limit, and the ability to flip background tiles horizontally or vertically. It even had a scanline counter, likely the first console to ever have such a feature built in as standard. It also featured a sprite zoom feature that was supposed to double the size of all sprites on screen, though it was buggy and didn't work properly, so no commercial games actually used it. This would be the same chip that would later be used inside the Master System 2 and Game Gear, with a couple of modifications such as fixing the sprite zoom bug and some new resolutions. This would be a good time to cover the power base converter for the Mega Drive, also known as the Mega Adapter or Master System Converter, that allowed it to play Master System games. Unlike other similar add-ons like the Super Game Boy, there wasn't any real circuitry inside the power base converter. All it really did was provide a different shaped cartridge slot and a card slot as well in order to plug SMS games into it. This is because the Mega Drive already had the hardware to play Master System games. When it detected a Master System game, the VDP would switch into Mode 4. The Master System used a Zilog Z80 as its CPU, and the Mega Drive also had one of these, but it was normally used as a sound coprocessor. So in addition to switching the VDP into Mode 4 or SMS mode, the converter also granted the Z80 full control, temporarily making it the main CPU, while the Motorola 68000 the Mega Drive normally used sat idle. Even though they weren't supposed to, a couple of Master System games did try to make use of the legacy modes, namely Graphics 2, and the most notable of these was F-16 Fighting Falcon. But remember how I mentioned earlier that the Mega Drive didn't support these modes? This is why this game doesn't work with the power base converter. There are some other games, like Micro Machines, that took advantage of the increased vertical resolution of the SMS2, and these don't work on the Mega Drive either. This brings us to Mode 5, the Mega Drive's native mode. Sega continued to develop the VDP from the Master System and engineered a completely customised proprietary chip, maintaining Mode 4 but greatly expanding its capabilities, and they called all this new stuff Mode 5. It had a much greater range of colours and doubled the number of colours on screen, 2 independently scrolling background layers called planes, an optional static window plane on one of those layers, higher resolutions, larger sprites, and more sprites on screen. It could also vertically scroll either of the background planes in smaller segments, giving it a similar capability to the Super Nintendo's offset per tile feature, albeit coarser as it could only do it in segments 16 pixels or 2 tiles wide, as opposed to the SNES that could do it in segments 8 pixels or 1 tile wide. Nonetheless, it could still be used to create convincing looking tilts, like what's seen in this mini-boss fight in Contra Hardcore, or the Leaning Tower in Castlevania Bloodlines. The tilting head of the Cheshire Cat boss in The Adventures of Batman and Robin is another good example. It didn't need to activate a special mode to do this, it was always available to use. We've studied a number of games in the past that use this 2-column vertical offset feature in combination with line scrolling to create wave patterns, such as this level in Wings of War, also known as Gynog. Both planes are actually being manipulated in slightly different ways to get this result. We've also seen it used on this map on the title screen of McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. I do need to reiterate that the Mega Drive did not have different graphics modes that games could run in like the Super Nintendo had. It was a one-size-fits-all approach. Mode 5 contained everything the hardware was capable of doing. If we were to compare it to one of the Super Nintendo's modes directly, it would be closest to Mode 2, having 2 layers of 4 bits per pixel, with tables for horizontal line scrolling and vertical column scrolling. It had the addition of the optional static window plane, which was actually a subplane of plane A, but of course had access to far fewer colours. Only 64 colours, or 61 once you subtract the transparent ones, were possible on screen at once, in most circumstances, from a master palette of 512. However, with raster effects and some clever programming that took advantage of the faster CPU, it could do a pretty good job of emulating a few of the things in software that the SNES had built-in hardware support for. One such example was using scanline interrupts to change the colour palettes partway down the screen, often seen in many water levels like the ones in Sonic the Hedgehog to emulate the transparency. When it changed the palettes mid-frame like this though, it resulted in some weird graphic corruption, which we can see more clearly if we disable the sprite layer to remove the waves that are covering it up. This is probably the main reason why they added the waves as sprites on top. There's also a weird set of dots in the bottom right corner of the screen. These are also there on original hardware, but in most cases you wouldn't see them, as they would be outside the bounds of the screen, cut off by the TV's overscan. It could also vertically stretch and compress background planes, which is a technique that's come up a few times in my How Did They Do That series, such as this example in James Pond 3. Another one we've previously looked at is Alien Soldier, Firstly, this frog boss, where it's used a bit more subtly, but it's pretty obvious. What might not be as obvious is that it's also happening with the wings on this butterfly boss, switching the scroll position of the background between the up and down wing positions after each compression, with a palette cycle to complete the effect. Check out this video if you want the full explanation of this. The version of Virtua Fighter 2 the console got was definitely one of the weirder ports to a home system back then, taking a game that was rendered in full 3D and reducing it down to a sprite-based 2D experience, running purely on base hardware. Opinions on it seem to be pretty divided, with some believing it's terrible, while others being of the opinion that it's surprisingly decent for what it is. I bring it up though because the floors of the stages do the same vertical stretch and compress trick when the characters jump in order to change the angle and give the stages a sense of depth, in addition to the line scrolling that we've studied other games using in previous videos. We can see a really cool implementation if we go back to the Adventures of Batman and Robin again to look at these shoot 'em up levels from a top-down perspective. It's combining that vertical stretching and contracting with line scrolling to create this 3D looking perspective effect in a very similar manner to how Super Nintendo games used HDMA. It's quite a convincing illusion. It could even create pseudo 3D rolling effects like the ones we see in Axlay on the Super Nintendo using almost exactly the same technique, and we see it in use in these bonus levels in Sonic 3D Blast in the background. The wooden path that Sonic runs down is also done with scanline interrupts. If you were interested in learning more, I have a video that provides an overview of the Mega Drive's standard graphical capabilities. Its faster CPU also generally meant it was better at pulling off some effects entirely in software than the Super Nintendo was, including real-time 3D like we see here in Kawasaki Superbike Challenge. Within Mode 5, there are a couple of other modes, sub-modes I guess you could call them, that could be turned on and off by setting specific registers in the VDP. Using these still retained all of the capabilities, although they did come with some restrictions. The first of these is the Shadow and Highlight mode, that darkened or brightened the console's 512 colour palette to expand the available colours, depending on what it was used for. The Vector Man games were well known for making good use of this mode. I've covered Shadow and Highlight quite extensively already in this video, so check that out if you want to know exactly how it worked, what it was capable of, and what its limitations were. Another mode that I haven't actually talked about before is interlaced mode. Yeah, like the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive was actually capable of interlacing too. Except it's somewhat confusing because interlacing itself had a couple of different modes, it wasn't just off or on. Off was referred to as Mode 0, and when it was turned on, there were two operating modes. Mode 1, where the odd lines display the same graphics as the even lines, and Mode 2, where the odd lines display different graphics to the even lines. Regardless of the mode, interlacing was extremely rare to see on the console. Sega actually warned that using interlace Mode 1, where the image was the same on odd and even lines, would result in blurry visuals, but it preserves the aspect ratio. A couple of games used it, such as the Mega Drive ports of Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys, and Valis 3. In the case of Ys 3, it's an option in the pause menu to turn it off and on, and in Valis 3, you need to pause the game, then press up and A to turn it on, and up and C to turn it off. In the case of both of these games, it's meant to make the text more readable if the TV had issues displaying it, but it did make the games look jittery when in motion. Some emulators don't seem to emulate this mode properly and look the same with it on or off. In Interlace Mode 2, where the image was different on the odd and even lines, vertical resolution was actually doubled, from 320 by 224 to 320 by 448 over 2 frames. However, because the horizontal resolution wasn't increasing, the image appeared squashed when output on the TV screen. Again, only a couple of games used this, and only in 2-player split screen at that. One of them was Combat Cars, and the other was Sonic the Hedgehog 2. To prevent the squashing, specific art assets would need to have been made just for this mode, which would have used more ROM space, not to mention be more time consuming to make. I guess they did this so the whole image could appear in each half of the screen without needing to cut half of it out, but what did Sonic do to deserve getting squashed like that? On the subject of resolutions, something I haven't really covered much is the rarely used lower resolution mode. The Mega Drive's native resolution is 320 by 224, otherwise known as H40 mode because it was 40 tiles across, and the majority of its games use this. However, it could also run in 256 by 224, also known as H32 mode because it was 32 tiles across, which matches the native resolution of the Super Nintendo and some other systems. As the lower resolution used less VRAM, it seems the games that use this mode often did it for performance reasons. Porting a game from another platform that had a lower native resolution would also be a valid use case, in order to make the process easier and quicker. Some examples of games that use the H32 mode are Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist, Flashback, Super Street Fighter 2, Formula 1, Mega Bomberman, and the aforementioned Valis 3. Interestingly, the one and only game to use the Sega Virtua Processor or SVP chip, Virtua Racing, also runs in this lower resolution mode. There were a number of games that used one resolution during gameplay and the other for menus and title screens, such as Lemmings, which runs in H32 mode for gameplay and H40 mode everywhere else. Most of the time, you probably wouldn't even notice, but an odd example of this is Phantom 2040. During gameplay, it runs in H40 mode, but in the weapon menu, it uses H32 mode. You can clearly see stuff like the health and ammo bars, weapon selection, life counter, and even the Phantom himself changing size as you swap between the two screens as the H32 image is stretched to fill the space. Who knows why they did this, but it definitely looks pretty weird. So that's about it for the base hardware. There's probably more little things in there that you might have realised. I didn't cover the operating modes of the Mega CD and 32X add-ons this time around, as I've already covered those in detail in this video, so check that one out if you're interested in learning more about how those devices worked. Something I don't cover in that video though is the Mega CD or Sega CD actually had a couple of boot modes. Mode 1 allowed it to boot from a cartridge, and Mode 2 set it to boot from the CD, which was the default mode. The system knew which one to use by detecting if a cartridge was plugged in. Booting from the cartridge allowed for faster boot times and opened up the possibility of running a hybrid setup, where a cartridge game could take advantage of the Mega CD's hardware or the CD format in some way. I could only track down 2 titles that use this elusive boot mode 1, neither of which are what you call games, more like utilities. The more well known of these was Flux, a music visualizer tool that was only released in Europe, which booted from a cartridge but required the Mega CD to function, showing a message on screen if you didn't have one attached. You just put in any music CD you wanted, and the software would play the disc like a regular CD player, while showing customizable effects on screen and providing some really basic controls. It wasn't anything too special, but it gives us a glimpse of what was possible. There's no actual games that I'm aware of that use this. So here's an overview of all the modes again. Modes 0 to 3 were used on the SG-1000. Mode 4 was the Master System mode, but retained mode 0 to 3 for backwards compatibility. Mode 5 was the Mega Drive mode, but retained mode 4 for backwards compatibility. Within mode 5 you had additional optional modes: Shadow and Highlight, Interlaced, which had modes of its own, and a lower resolution mode. And just for completeness, the 32X had 3 operating modes: Packed Pixel, Run Length, and Direct Color, and the Mega CD had 2 operating modes, 1M and 2M. And as we just covered, the Mega CD also had a couple of boot modes, Mode 1 and Mode 2. So, did the Mega Drive have different modes? The answer is, well, kinda. That's it, I hope you learned something. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.